the most powerful thing that we can do is to start with the truth, that the problem is the monopoly system itself, the utilities themselves and their behavior and their incentives and their choices. And that if we can always name that and how it's showing up, it helps people see that problem.
Hi, folks. Ken Cook here. And you just heard from my guest today, John Farrell. John is a co-director of the Institute for Local Self Reliance, and he directs the Institute's Energy Democracy Initiative. Widely known as the guru of distributed energy, and you'll find out why, John has received accolades for his vivid illustrations of the economic and environmental benefits of local ownership of decentralized renewable energy. He hosts an amazing podcast, the Local Energy Rules Podcast. It's a must-listen where he and his fantastic guests discuss monopoly power, as in literal power both ways. The power that comes through your outlets and the political power that electric companies wield over all of our lives. John outlines on his show how communities can take advantage and take charge to transform their energy system. And there are lots of possibilities out there that we have yet to realize. In today's conversation, you'll hear John and I refer to the IRA, as in the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed Congress in 2022. Suffice it to say, we have a lot to talk about. Welcome, John. I'm thrilled you could join us today. To start off, give me some of your background. Tell our audience about your path to this passion of yours, which is local energy policy and control.
Well, Ken, thanks so much for having me and for the warm introduction. I really, really appreciate it. I often tell people that it was sort of random luck. I took a really amazing class in graduate school on energy policy and was, pardon the pun, turned on very much by what I was learning about nuclear energy, about how the grid worked, about how you do energy policy. And I remember as I was finishing graduate school thinking, well, it'd be interesting if I could work on energy policy. But I was, doing the thing that a lot of people do when they graduate, which is just figuring out where can you get a job. And I actually contacted the Institute for Local Self Reliance more so because I had seen some interesting things that they'd been working on actually around sports stadiums and like local ownership of teams and, sort of community oriented stadiums. And I said, oh, this organization's interesting. I'd just like to find out what they're doing. And they had a job opening at the time. So when I asked for an informational interview, they said, why don't you just interview for this job? And I said, okay, I guess I could do that. And I got it. So that was 18 years ago. And there's been a lot of on-the-job training.
Meant to be, yeah.
Yeah, but sort of fell into it accidentally, though definitely it has turned out to be a very strong merger of interests.
Well, one of the things that immediately attracted me to the Institute and its frame on issues was that I came across at a time when big environmental policy, federal policy, making big things supposedly happen was all the rage. And obviously EWG has been part of that. But, the environmental community came up during a time when we, thought that federal policy, national policy acting on that stage was paramount. And I remember thinking when I came across the Institute, the perspective really was arresting to me. There were so many ways in which the topics and concerns I was pursuing, EWG was pursuing, other groups were pursuing at the national level, we're really missing out. We're really missing something because we weren't grounded in local advocacy and a local focus and the nitty-gritty of getting things done. And I think organizations who had focused on that weren't getting the support that some of the national environmental groups were getting. Even a small group like EWG, it was surprising to me, but that perspective really grabbed me. And it's really a completely different way to think about advocacy and empowering people where they live.
Absolutely. And I think it's funny because I had my own education after being hired at ILSR about what it really meant. I had seen a couple of the things that they'd worked on, but really didn't understand the philosophy of the organization at all when I started here. One of the first things that we were working on was ethanol. And it's obviously been a very controversial topic in environmental policy ever since. But at the time, our focus was on a very unique an interesting part of it, which was how do you get farmers to own the means of production of ethanol so that they have this insurance against commodity prices that otherwise rule their lives? Because when you have an ethanol plant, as a farmer owner of an ethanol plant, when crop prices are low, then you can sell your corn to your own ethanol plant and then you can sell ethanol for a lower price. And when crop prices are high, you can sell your crop and make less ethanol. So it's this beautiful opportunity to give more control to farmers and to rural communities over their economic future in a way that also had at least a marginal environmental benefit. At the time, we didn't really have any other way to reduce gasoline usage. We've obviously moved on since then to talk about a lot of other things, but that undercurrent and the lesson for me of the importance of focusing on how we talk about the economic benefits and who benefits from the decisions in our energy system has stuck with me ever since.
And there's a more than a cautionary tale there, right? I mean, we've worked on ethanol, I think some years later than probably you were working on it. And from a different angle, we were concerned about the impact on the environment once we understood that a little bit better. But on the ownership question, all these farmers seem to have gotten bought out, right?
Yeah, I mean, the sad part is, I think it was right the late aughts. Is that what we call it?
Yeah.
Leading into about 2010, Wall
Yeah.
Street saw that there was money in this. There were states, especially in the Midwest, that were mandating blends of ethanol into vehicle fuel, and they saw an opportunity to buy up the farmer-owned plants or to build their own ethanol plants with Wall Street financing and earn a hefty return. And that was really our turning as an organization against it. We sort of
Yeah.
sat out of the environmental debate, but once it became clear that it wasn't actually going to benefit farmers substantially, it felt like, well, there's other ways to approach this. And in some ways, actually, that's kind of what kicked off our early interest in electric vehicles was, hey, if we're not really going to see a benefit to communities from putting ethanol into vehicles, then let's find something that is more environmentally sustainable. And then also has an interesting connection, which is once I'm putting electricity in my car, well, I can produce my own electricity from solar or from community owned wind projects. And so there was another opportunity there to think about how communities could benefit, but from a different technological approach.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So how did you move from focusing the early focus on ethanol and ownership of ethanol plants into the whole question of distributed energy, community control of it, and what it might mean? I have to say, this is one of the most frustrating areas that EWG works in. As I said at the top, we're relative newcomers. We started our first rate case, our first involvement with public utility policy was out here in California when there was an attack and an ongoing attack on rooftop solar. And it just infuriated me. As a passion project, we jumped in. I was stunned at how hard it was to participate in public utility policymaking. The hoops we had to jump through, the lawyers and experts we had to hire just to feel like we had a fighting chance at having our arguments heard. And the cost of it was astonishing. This is not for the faint hearted. So everything could be different than we're seeing now. The whole thing could be done differently. That's what I always take away from your podcasts and your writings is that we have right in front of us the makings of a completely different energy system. And I don't think anyone really has described these prospects better than you have, just how different it can be than the regulated monopoly model we now have that has made war against distributed energy generation and control and distribution. So you've been at the center of it. So, how did you make the move into that area? And give us a little sense of what is the alternative or what are some of the alternatives sitting right in front of us that we ought to be pursuing, but the powers that be are making it difficult, to say the least.
Yeah. Well, I feel in some ways blessed to have had the longevity on these issues that I have because when we first started working on solar, for example, it was at a time when it was 10 times, 15 times more expensive than it is now. So it was more of a niche thing. And so the powers that be weren't terribly interested in it.
Yeah.
They weren't concerned about it. They hadn't considered it. And so, I was actually looking at European policy a lot back around 2010 because those were the countries that were really leading on figuring out how do we deploy solar, how do we drive the cost down. But it became clear pretty soon, and after that, I wrote a piece on solar grid parity, as we called it, sort of like when is the price of solar going to be the same as the electricity you buy from the grid? And I remember thinking, like, take places in California as early as like 2012, 2013, it's going to be comparable. maybe even without subsidies. And this is going to change everything. Like, we're going to be able to produce electricity from rooftops and people can own their own power plant.
Parking lots, schools,
Oh,
churches,
everywhere.
right? Everywhere.
Absolutely. And so it felt like, oh, the technology is going to just naturally allow us to make this transition toward more community ownership, to more community decision making. And it was over those ensuing few years where I realized, oh, this isn't happening the way that I expected it to. And then realized, oh, that's on purpose. It's not happening that way because, as you said, the powers that be, the incumbent utility companies realized at that point, as solar was just starting to get popular, this is a threat in two different ways. It's a threat to the sales of electricity, which sort of undergird what we do and threatens our ability to produce electricity and sell it, but also threatens the way that we make money by building more infrastructure because it provides this distinct, clear alternative to buying power from the utility to needing to use their poles and wires and their substations and everything. So, my awakening on the monopoly power issue was really about working with people on things like community solar, on rooftop solar, and realizing, wow, we're hitting a brick wall here.
Yeah. And they've got so much money,
Oh, absolutely.
and it's
They have
our
our money.
money.
Our money,
Yeah,
exactly.
no, and they use it with a vengeance, including we've had recent cases, I guess, in Illinois and Ohio illegally. I'm sure those are the only cases we've discovered. There are probably many more where they've bribed elected officials or otherwise subverted democratic processes that are supposedly at the heart of regulating utilities. Right? That's the bargain. So when utilities a century ago were rising up and they were, you know, needlessly trying to compete for the same geographic area, the decisions were made to, well, let's just give monopoly control in specific geographic areas, and then we'll regulate it for the benefit of consumers. We'll make sure that the prices are fair, that these utilities that have complete control, and you have no choice, you've got one power company that's coming your way, that they'll be fairly regulated. I don't know if it ever really worked, but from the histories I've read, there were always struggles for these utility regulators to be independent from the forces, the companies they were regulating. And now it's really clear that these utilities across the country, and we've had tremendous battles here in California, are dead set against the kinds of energy system that you're describing. Distributed energy, locally owned and controlled, that's not their thing. They make money by selling electricity, and they sell electricity to generate profits in many cases for shareholders. And on top of that, the maintenance of the grid, all their capital expenses, at least here in California, they get a nice 10% guaranteed profit. So, of course, they start a wildfire, which PG&E has done here multiple times. The wildfire gets put out. They get 10% to bury transmission lines. They even get a profit for putting out the fire. It's just unbelievable. Why is it, do you think, that more environmentalists aren't engaged with these utility battles? Or maybe that's not your impression, but it certainly is mine.
Yeah. Let me touch on one thing from the history I think is important. It helps us understand where we are, which is in those early days when we made this agreement of like, let's form monopoly utilities. The economically rational part of it was let's stop the competition from causing us to string multiple sets of wires to every property, right?
Makes sense.
We only need one grid. That makes sense. But the sort of hidden part of it is that the utilities, the for profit utilities, were also looking to fend off competition from the publicly owned ones because cities had realized, hey, this is a crucial public service. Either we can provide it ourselves by starting our own utility, or we can buy out the private providers and be public utilities. And these investor owned companies were saying, oh, we can't really compete with the publicly owned ones because they have access to cheaper capital, they have democratic oversight. But if we say that we're going to have public oversight through state regulation, it will take the heat off. We'll be able to say, actually, you guys do have oversight over us, and everybody will win. And to some degree, that was true in terms of electricity prices going down and access growing. Obviously, the environmental concerns were not present in those conversations
Yeah.
and considered externalities. But at any rate, that sort of set us up for the system that we have today, which is this sort of implicit idea that utilities are well regulated. There is regulation in place, but I think, as you said and you've seen, it's definitely insufficient to ensure the public interest. And I think why a lot of environmental groups don't think about it is, Well, it's hard. Number one,
Yeah.
as you've pointed out, intervening in the public utility system is really challenging. You're up against often lawyers or other experts that the utility has on full time payroll who do this every day,
Yeah.
day in and day out. They might have technical expertise that you don't have in your environmental organization. They're using very technical language and technical terms that are very intimidating. And then the procedures that happen are very hard to understand. I think I featured one in this report that I've written about monopoly utilities called Upcharge that we recently released. That in order to, for example, follow along the rooftop solar debate in California, it needed to follow 7 separate proceedings,
Yeah.
which were all taking a different slice of it and proceeding in different timelines and into different levels of complexity. But I think the second thing too is that there is, I think, a naive belief that we don't have to confront the issue of power to win, that we can somehow buy off utilities, convince them that green energy is cost effective or can make a profit, and that if we just sort of reorient them, they'll do the things that we need from a climate perspective, from a clean energy perspective, and that it will work out okay. And I think, unfortunately, the lesson that we've learned so far is that that does not, in fact, work.
Yeah, I don't think it does work, and I think that is the view. It raises for me competing feelings about the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'd love to hear what your take is on it. I mean, we lauded it when it was passed. We thought it was great that there were incentives going in, but I also know some of its most enthusiastic supporters, and there was a great story about this early on in the New York Times. The most enthusiastic supporters were in many ways the power companies. They got very, very excited about the incentives in the Inflation Reduction Act that would help them get taxpayers' money for what they were planning to do anyway. So again, I'm not knocking the IRA, but the reality is this was part and parcel of the approach you just described. Well, maybe it's just too hard to take on the utilities. Maybe we want to just make them go faster in the direction of renewables and not worry too much about these power struggles over control and what it might mean for local communities and even families.
I think the lesson of the IRA is that if you don't intentionally confront the status quo, you're going to enable its continuation. I would rather have it than not have it, for sure, because
For
a
sure.
lot of the money that is coming out of the IRA is going into environmental justice communities. It's going into community based solar installations. It's going to reduce the cost of solar, particularly for folks who live in marginalized communities who might not have had access before. Like it does many of those good things, but it's really silent on this issue of ownership and control of the grid. And one of the lessons in my research has been you can't be silent on it.
Yeah.
That if you are, it just allows the utilities to continue dominating the system. And the problem is that the IRA went to attack one key piece of the challenge of building clean energy and giving people benefits from it, which was the cost. It said, okay, we're going to throw tons and tons of money at buying down the cost of clean energy. So we're essentially shifting money from taxpayers into the energy system to buy down the cost of clean energy. And in that sense, it's going to be very successful, I think. I mean, I think we are going to see it really help accelerate clean energy deployment. The model suggests that. I think we're seeing, as some of those dollars finally start to filter through the different programs, that it is going to do that. But the problem is that, and this is part of what I've found in my research specifically and been focused on, is that utilities are increasingly able to be gatekeepers to how that money is going to be spent.
Totally.
And that the concern I have, the biggest concern I have, is that that $350 billion IRA is not going to get spent efficiently. It's not going to, or maybe even get deployed at all, because utilities are able to erect these barriers to communities, to individuals, installing solar, installing clean energy systems, installing batteries. And, the California fight over rooftop solar is a perfect illustration of this, that utilities lobbied over many, many years and finally won, getting regulators to agree to reduce compensation for rooftop solar. So in some ways, we're like substituting federal tax money for the failure of California regulators to effectively push back and maintain the public interest in Californians and having rooftop solar. And the irony, of course, is that something like 2/3 of the clean energy that was being deployed in California, which has some of the most ambitious clean energy goals of any state, was coming from the rooftops, was coming from all these
Yeah.
individual
Yeah.
businesses and homes that were saying, hey, we'll do solar and we'll help you get toward your goals. And so, they cut themselves off at the knees in order to protect utility shareholders. And unfortunately, right at a time when we're trying to press the accelerator
Yeah.
on deploying clean
Yeah,
energy.
no, that drove me crazy during the debate on the IRA. It was really frustrating because if the IRA was going to extend the provisions that gave tax benefits for putting rooftop solar on your house or your apartment building or a school or fill in the blank, and then the utilities were going to the Public Utility Commission and basically removing a like amount of incentive that was there before, it's kind of a jump ball. And so what's left? And my nightmare scenario is, well, this rooftop solar thing it's too bad it's a subsidy for rich people like Ken, who has it on his roof. Too bad it's a subsidy that is making poor people pay more of the share of the grid expenses because I'm getting off scot free. In fact, I'm making money by generating electricity, and working class people don't have that option. None of that was true, but that was the argument. And so all of a sudden, we have the situation where when utilities say solar, they mean solar farms. And that means in California and elsewhere, big controversial solar farms in rural areas. In our case, it's the Central Valley and transmission lines. So we need to force through policies to loosen up regulations for transmission lines because we have to get that solar power from solar farms here to the city where it belongs instead of putting it on rooftops in the city. That's the conundrum that really bothers me. And again, it just comes from not taking on the power structure, pardon the pun, that's in place that controls our power structure.
I wrote a piece called The Farce of Free Delivery about this contention we have between rooftop solar and large scale solar. And one of the myths that utilities continue to propagate is that there is a substantial difference in price. And it's really just about a preference for where things are located and who owns it. It's not about what's going to save people money and who can participate. And I think one of the greatest farces of all is the fact that you have utilities out there pretending to be advocates for low income folks.
Oh my God.
Utilities that, took public money during the pandemic in order to keep people connected and then disconnected them from the grid by the millions that have been jacking up CEO pay, raising utility rates. There's such a broad scale of assault by the utilities on electric customers. And for them to take this one issue of solar and to turn it into a battleground is just evidence about their ability to control the conversation and their disingenuousness about wanting to actually address the problems of clean energy, of equity, of electricity affordability, of resilience. Like all of these things are tied up in how we can use solar energy. And the utility is really bound up in just one key thing, which is how do we profit the most from this? And the irony is that, even in places like California, and there are some other states like this, the utilities don't own the power plants in those
Yeah.
states. We restructured the market, which is one step in the right direction a number of years ago, but because they still build and own transmission lines and substations and the infrastructure of the grid, they still favor this way of building things that requires the most possible infrastructure. And so whether that's burying power lines at an enormous premium in order to solve a reliability problem that is due to their lack of ongoing maintenance funding, which they don't earn that 10% profit on,
Yeah.
or wanting to build large scale solar farms because it means getting to build transmission lines in order to support those investments. Utilities have really played this game in a continuous way to support the maximum value for shareholders and the least possible for customers. In fact, I have an opinion piece I've been working on called The Tale of Two Equities, where I'm hoping to talk about this, where equity has become this really important term in our clean energy and climate movement. And as we talk about it as advocates, it's about how do we adequately distribute the benefits of the clean energy transition to everybody. But utilities have been thinking about equity forever, and they're talking about shareholder equity.
Yeah.
And the two are really not compatible. We can't keep giving utilities 10% return on all the capital they invest and also see a system in which we achieve equity based on the past harms that utilities have done to communities, based on the fact that we don't need to build energy in these large scale utility owned systems with big transmission, that we have many other ways that we can do it that can distribute the economic benefits. So I think that's really frustrating to see the way that the utilities have been able to perpetrate this lie upon us about how the system should be run and about whether it's cost effective or not. Meanwhile, with the other hand, cutting people off from power, raising utility rates, polluting in our communities.
Yeah, no, it's unbelievable. Pacific Gas and Electric, I live in their territory in Northern California. I don't think there's a more reviled company in the state of California than PG&E. They keep raising the rates. They started all these forest fires. They were convicted of dozens of homicides for the people who died in those fires, thousands and thousands of homes and commercial buildings destroyed because of decades of neglect. They just weren't keeping up those power lines as they were expected to do. That money went out to the shareholders. One of the moments where I became even more passionate about it, I went to one of these big conventions, trade shows, and on the trade show floor, just walking from one end to the other, you could literally see the makings of an alternative energy system. Dozens of battery providers, people who made the fasteners that put the solar panels on your roof. And everyone I stopped by, they told me why their fastening system was so superior to what was out there already and their competitors. Of course, many solar panel manufacturers, and the whole system was right there. Information technology that could power microgrids and community based solar that would make it possible to be largely independent from the overall grid and still be much more reliable. You see that and you think, oh my gosh, how do we get more of that if the utilities are against it? How do we get people involved?
What I love about that story, Ken, is that what you experience as you walk through that trade hall is what we have come as Americans to expect what happens in our economy generally, that smart people come up with great ideas and they can
Yeah.
get rewarded for it. And I think the sad part about our utility system is that it does the exact opposite, is that it preserves profits and inertia and an old way of doing things for a select group of people that were given this monopoly power over 100 years ago, and to the expense of all of these folks who are trying to innovate. And then the
Yeah.
utility exercises that authority that it has, that we've given it as a public trust, to deliberately quash the innovation that could allow us to have access to these clever new ways of delivering energy in ways that's really disappointing. And so I think, one of what I take hope from is that even in the limited amount of reach that we've been able to have as an individual organization, but then also the growth of that with other coalitions and whatnot, is that the most powerful thing that we can do is start with the truth. That the problem is that is the monopoly system itself,
Yeah.
the utilities themselves and their behavior and their incentives and their choices. And that if we can always name that and how it's showing up, it helps people see that problem. So one of the first problems that I have encountered in this work is that some people don't even see that there's a problem or they don't understand how it's showing up. And helping people see like, hey, that decision in California about solar, that wasn't about low income folks.
No.
It wasn't about affordability on the grid. It wasn't about, rich people versus poor people. It was about a utility trying to protect its profits from competition. And yes, there are elements of some of those other issues that need to be discussed in appropriate policy solutions. But if you understand that fundamentally this is a utility acting to protect its shareholders, you will better understand how the debate is happening, why it's happening in this particular inaccessible and challenging place for other people to talk about it, and why we're losing,
Yeah.
and why it's so hard to make progress on clean energy, on climate change in ways that benefits everybody within the system. And I found with allies that we've worked with in different places that it starts with a few advocacy groups, and then all of a sudden you start seeing some of those trade organizations or solar installers saying, there's some cover for us to talk about how we see this monopoly power as a problem. Before, we were afraid. We were afraid to talk about it because if we spoke up, the utility would punish us,
Yeah.
and we have to work with them because they operate the grid.
Yeah, those connection times. Yeah, those connect. I've heard from many installers. We speak up too much against PG&E or whatever utility whose area we work in, and before you know it, there's a couple weeks, maybe a month or two delay in getting someone out here to approve or turn on our rooftop solar system. It's a real control they have to worry about.
Yeah, that's been the invisible part too. So I think, you mentioned earlier like Ohio and Illinois and the political corruption of utilities. I think most Americans can look at big corporations like utilities and be like, yeah, I expect that they're going to do that.
Sure.
We still want them to get caught and prosecuted if it's blatantly illegal, but yeah, that's just like par for the course. But, the doubling down of it is, first of all, I have to pay for that as a customer. So that bribery that they're doing or that lobbying that they're doing, like I'm paying for that. And that to me feels like a real injustice. And then on top of that, they have the power to control how their competitors have access. So we don't even have a fair playing field here
Yeah.
because even when a competitor has an amazing idea of like, we can combine solar and energy storage and we can cut your like utility bill in half, the utility can go out there and find these little ways. Sometimes they're very nitpicky, like, oh, we're just going to make you like sign this additional contract or do this additional study of the grid or pay this additional like fixed charge on your bill and make it harder for their competitors to act in this space. And so I think the real missing piece that we've had is that utility regulators have been, for better for worse, focused mostly on like what is the overall cost of electricity to customers and is it reliable? And they've done a decent, might be too generous, but they've done a decent job depending on what state you live in and
Yeah.
who's been appointed and whatnot. But they've been completely oblivious to this issue of competition and the way that utilities have exercised their power in ways to prevent system transformation and innovation to an enormous cost. And especially at this time when we need that transformation to happen as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Even though we saw our grid being powered heavily by rooftop solar in California, for example, that was characterized as a problem. If you can imagine utility executives waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, "Oh my God, what about poor people? What, 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 maybe this rooftop solar thing's bad for them." That's not how it worked. They woke up thinking, "Hey, this could catch on. This could be a real problem. People are going to start innovating in a way that is going to make it hard for us to make the profits we've guaranteed to our shareholders by getting these profits on infrastructure investments. We need to string more transmission lines. We need to bury more of them. We need to do all kinds of things that earn us the ability to increase rates to pay for that 10% profit on that operation." It's crazy.
I think it's worth imagining like how the system could be different and the in particular in California, the failure of the regulators to really approach this in the right way. So they had an opportunity handed to them on a silver platter with PG&E's behavior in the wildfires, right? You have a utility that has had to file for bankruptcy because of gross negligence in its management of the grid, repeatedly causing widespread property damage and cost of human life. And this utility only operates at the grace of the state as a monopoly. It only has a license to provide services because the state guarantees it captive customers. And that was the moment to say,
Yeah.
we can change this. We can pick a different operator and we can pick somebody and give them the charge to do this grid in the way that we want and give them the priorities in the correct order, not build some clean energy and make a lot of profits and, if you can manage it, also keep prices low, but instead say something like, we want the maximum amount of clean energy that's operated in a way that benefits communities to the maximum degree, that keeps the energy affordable in an equitable way, and that looks to address historic harms of like where power plants have been located and the damage that that's done to the communities that live near them. And you could have picked someone else to operate. A perfect example in Hawaii in the early 1990s, the investor owned utility that served the island of Kauai decided to get out of the business. They basically decided to divest their utility arm. And what happened there is that a cooperative was formed of businesses and individuals on the island that basically bought out the utility's assets. It's now a cooperatively owned utility and has been for the past 30 years. They are something close to like 70% renewable in their electricity production. And
We were
despite
just
having,
there, panels everywhere.
right, and the prices are going down. Like compared to the other investor owned utility that serves Hawaii, their electric rates are going down because of the huge investment they've made in local clean energy to serve that island instead of the reluctance of the incumbent utility and the rest serving the rest of Hawaii to make the transition, clinging to its oil-fired power plants or its coal-fired power plants, clinging to the opportunity to make a profit for its shareholders instead of tapping into all of the customers that want to put solar on their rooftops. I mean, California could have done that. It had that moment. And instead, the regulators doubled down on keeping customers captive to a utility that had proven time and time again that it was incapable of doing this in the right ways. And the opportunity is there. There's actually, speaking of another complicated proceeding, but there is a proceeding. I think it's in front of the California Energy Commission, not the Public Utilities Commission. And it's called the High DER proceeding, High Distributed Energy Resources. And the purpose of that proceeding is just essentially to envision what could the grid look like. And one of the folks that's participating in that, and his work is amazing, and I just really admire it and has been inspirational to me is Lorenzo Christov. He used to work for CAISO, the grid
Yeah.
operator or
Hmm.
the transmission grid operator in California. And he saw this coming. He saw the problem of like when you have all these different folks that can produce their own energy, how you might need to redesign and rethink the system. And he's basically said, an ideally designed system would be like a third of the energy is produced by the customer themselves on their own rooftops. A third of the energy comes from other sources, but close by in your community. And the other third comes from the traditional large scale sources that are far away because we're going to need some of that interconnectedness. We're going to need
Yeah.
some of those resources, you know, for when it's not sunny where you are, or when it's not windy where you are, whatever. But it fundamentally rethinking the way that we've done it from like 90% central and far away to 60 or 70% local. And what he's found and what I very much believe is the case is that that will be less costly. It will be have less environmental impact. It has a much higher chance of being able to be done in a way that is affordable for people. It will be more resilient because the power is being produced in our community. We're
Yeah.
not dependent on a big long distance transmission line. And it can be done with efficient and inexpensive resources that we have all these, entrepreneurs are out there developing. So I'm just so sad for California to have missed that
Yeah.
moment. And I hope that it's a lesson for everyone else of like when you have that moment, seize it
Yeah.
and figure out how to change the structure of the system.
To me, it's a frontline question of, in many cases, environmental justice. If you just take the proposition that there is a cost shift on top of, and I don't buy this entirely, but let's say you do buy it, that there is a big cost shift where low income working class households are having to pay more than their fair share of maintaining the grid because other people have rooftop solar and get all the benefits and get out of paying some of those fees. Why not just invest more? If that is the case, let's just invest more in giving these opportunities to low income households. Let's not assume that rooftop solar is impossible to make work. We can make it work. The example you gave of Hawaii, and there are other examples around the country and around the world where it has worked when we've thought about it, but it doesn't work for the utilities making and maximizing their profits. That's the real cost shift. It's the shift from all of us into the bottom lines of the utilities and from the bottom lines out to the shareholders. It's organized banditry.
It's remarkable to me that the utilities have taken a problem that they have perpetuated for 125 years of screwing poor people, cutting them off from power, citing dirty power plants near them, all this shifting of costs of our energy system
Yeah.
onto those folks. And then in the case of solar, which could possibly transform that, have managed to pin all of the things that they have been guilty of for 100 years on this new technology that could be owned by other people.
Yeah.
I mean, they're excellent at marketing. I'll hand it to them. One of the best examples is getting to call these shutoffs. So the utilities now in California will shut off power to you if there's a threat from a wildfire that they haven't successfully managed through vegetation management or transmission upgrades. And they get to call it a public safety power shutoff.
Yeah.
What great marketing. They're basically telling you, we are your default utility that was supposed to provide you electricity. We are, in fact, mandated to serve you, but we're turning it off and we're giving it a clever name to make it sound like we're doing it for your own good.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
No, I see the TV ads out here all the time about what PG&E is doing for us by burying those power lines. No, we're doing that. We, the ratepayers, are burying the power lines. You're just operating the equipment and making the money. You've been so generous with your time. I learn so much every time I listen to your podcast, which, let me just say it again, Local Energy Rules podcast. You've got to listen to it if you're concerned about these issues at all. John has been the pioneer, one of the, I think, thought leaders, and he's also an activist. He's also engaged in these fights. But one last question. There will be a big difference this fall if the election goes a certain way, right? There'll be a big effort, I think, on the part of the Trump Vance administration if it comes to pass, as outlined in Project 2025. There'll be a real effort to go after the kinds of distributed energy possibilities, rooftop solar and all the rest. It'll be a real shift. What is your take on that, John, and what's at stake?
Let's just talk about the Inflation Reduction Act for a minute, right? A Trump Vance administration is going to absolutely work to undermine the implementation of that, to stop the dollars from flowing, and if possible, to repeal it entirely. So if you care about throwing money at solving climate change in an equitable way, then I would be very concerned about what a Trump Vance administration is going to do. The second thing, though, to keep in mind, and I think this actually gets to this idea of like, how do we build power to actually address the fundamental problem here of monopoly power among utilities? We've seen the Federal Trade Commission and the US Department of Justice attack corporate power more strongly under the Biden administration than any time in the last 50 years. They have really changed and reinvigorated this idea of, as we call it, antitrust or anti monopoly work by the federal government for the first time in a long time in a way that has already started to have its impacts on, especially like the tech industry. That, they've sued Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all looking at this issue of if you are controlling the platform of business, whether that's for social media communications or it's for buyers and sellers on Amazon, that we need to be avoiding conflicts of interest between those folks that operate those networks and the buyers and sellers and the folks that can participate in. So Amazon gets called out specifically, and you can see ILSR actually has a lot of work that we've put into
Yeah.
Amazon because we've recognized that small businesses are at a huge disadvantage when they have to basically go through the toll booth of Amazon in order to get on their platform and to reach people because Amazon controls so much of the online shopping dollar. And what I've been encouraged by, and I think we have an opportunity to continue, is that I think the federal government, these federal agencies, are well positioned to help attack this same problem in the utilities sector. That we have the same problem. That the problem is the utilities control the network by which all of these innovators who have solar panels and batteries and electric vehicle chargers and whatever could do so much good, but they have this toll booth, this gatekeeper of the utility looking to stop
Yeah.
them. And this is where our unexpected allies are as well, that the people who care about anti monopoly in the world may not have realized it's playing out in the utility sector. But these are really smart people and sometimes well funded. Well, probably never really well funded because, of course, they're not funded by corporate interests, but they are unexpected allies that we can bring into this fight who understand it from a different perspective, a different legal perspective. They have the stories to tell from different industries. I had someone on my podcast, Local Energy Rules, Doug Cantor from the
Yeah.
National Association of Convenience Stores, who's intervening. You've got convenience stores in like utility dockets. And I remember doing a double take and saying, well, why are you guys here?
Right.
And they're like, well, we have gas stations, we fuel vehicles, and the utility wants to own all the EV chargers, but that's our job. We fuel cars. We want to be in on this. Like, this is an anti competitive move to let the utility control it all.
Of course.
So I think what I've learned from that is number one, a Trump Vance administration would be a disaster for the climate money that we've put in through the IRA. It's probably also going to be a disaster for antitrust enforcement. There's no guarantee that a Harris administration is going to be awesome. I mean, Biden was kind of unique. We should be looking closely at what Harris says about what she's going to do when it comes to anti monopoly policy and to fighting corporate power. But I would definitely tell people as you're thinking about how you vote, look at this question of corporate power and what the candidates promise to do at your federal level, at the state level, wherever you're electing people, because we have an opportunity to bring that in. And we are seeing people talk about it and care about it. And we have this opportunity, I think, to make friends with folks who have been working on this in different areas in the tech industry and bring them into the utility and industry and say, hey, we have the same problem. And I think that, we can work together and be that much stronger in fighting it.
Yeah. Makes all the sense in the world. So, okay, one last question because I've read a fair amount of your work, but I'd love to hear an actual war story from you that speaks to the whole question of community solar. You hear that term bandied about quite a bit, and it always seems so hopeful to me. And the examples I've come across, wow, why isn't the whole grid composed of community solar? Tell us a little bit about community solar. And it's been particularly encouraging, I think, in Minnesota. You've had some real wins there.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. Community solar, the idea basically is not everybody owns a sunny rooftop and has the money to put solar on that sunny rooftop. In fact, maybe 1 in 4 Americans is in that situation where they have both the money and the property and the good solar resource in order to put up solar panels in a way that would be affordable. So the idea behind community solar is, hey, this is a transformational technology in terms of how we generate energy. How can we let people invest in it, benefit from it, even if they don't own that sunny rooftop? And so some of the early models were like you put solar panels on a church in the community and you let different members of the neighborhood bring their own money and say, hey, I'd like to buy one panel or five panels or 20 panels, however much I can afford. And I get a benefit from that. I get a slice of the energy sales from that solar panel providing electricity to the church. And without getting into the weeds of like all of the policy of how you make that work, the basic idea is hey, we have two things that we're addressing right now, maybe three. One is many more people who couldn't get into solar can get into solar. So it's an equity benefit of expanding the universe of folks who can do it. But we're also bringing a lot more capital into the energy transition. So instead of relying just on utilities and Wall Street, we now have all this money from communities that can be used to help be invested in and to accelerate that clean energy transition by putting up solar all over the place. 15 years ago, to do this, you basically had to do a really complex and very unique and challenging one-off kind of project design. So I featured some of them on my early podcast episodes. These were sort of like the pioneers of figuring out how do we thread the legal things and the securities regulations and the state policy and the electricity policy all to make this work. And what's really exciting about the last 15 years is that now we have 15 to 20 states that have policies that simplify that process, that create a program that's designed around allowing this to happen, that simplify the investment rules, that make it clear what benefit you're going to get, that have consumer protections for people who are going to participate in it. And it's growing a lot. In Minnesota, we have over 800 megawatts of community solar that's been developed. That's about the size of a nuclear reactor in terms of its capacity for electricity production. And most of that is owned by either individuals. There's over, I think, 13 or 14,000 individual residential participants in that program. But even the commercial electricity customers that have bought into it are school districts and cities
Yeah.
and park boards and libraries. Like I think something like two-thirds or more of the capacity under that program is either individuals or these public interest institutions. And so it's widely dispersing the economic benefits of our renewable energy transition, which is exactly what it was designed to do.
And what do utilities think about all of this?
So our program it operates in a single utilities service territory, Xcel Energy, which is the biggest investor-owned utility here in Minnesota. And we were very busy putting a lot of policy through in 2013 when community solar was adopted. And I think it was a sleeper and they didn't realize the impact that it could have. And ever since they realized a couple months after that legislative session ended, they have fought it tooth and nail.
Yeah.
And sometimes they've won. Most of the time they lost. But sometimes they have won and made it harder for us. And that fight is ongoing. There's actually litigation right now about a similar kind of decision that our Public Utilities Commission made, like the one that California regulators made that favored the utility and made things less good for community solar in Minnesota. But on the whole, it's been great. And Minnesota has served as an inspiration to many other places to pursue similar policies. And I think it's one of the most hopeful things because community solar it's not just about like who and the money, it's about resilience. It's about building energy systems in our communities to make us better able to survive what climate change is going to throw at us. So it's definitely one of the things that I am most excited about that I work on. And I think one of the most hopeful examples of what we can achieve if we can successfully push back on the utility monopoly power.
Well, and you write about it so well and so regularly. I'm just grateful that we had a chance to share it with our listeners in this episode. And thank you for that amazing work. You can see why utilities are so nervous to keep this genie in the bottle. They just are so intimidated. And that's the message we keep telling people. Why are these utilities fighting so hard against this? And if you don't understand it's about money and profits, and if you don't understand that it's about maybe losing the grip of a regulated monopoly arrangement on captive ratepayers, if you don't understand that, I think it just seems bewildering and too hard to deal with, and you just move on. Let's build more nuclear plants. Let's, whatever the fantasy might be, when the solution's right in front of us and it benefits so many people, small businesses, individual homeowners, school districts, on and on. So thank you for being such an inspiring leader, John. I've learned so much, and I just can't say enough about the Institute. Again, a beacon out there for leadership and advocacy on issues that are important to all of us. So thank you so much for joining this episode. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Ken. I really appreciate the invitation, and it was delightful to talk with you.
Thank you, John Farrell, for coming on the show, and thank you out there for listening. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to check out our show notes for additional links to take a deeper dive into today's discussion. Make sure to follow our show on Instagram at Ken Cook's Podcast. And if you're interested in learning more about EWG, you can head over to ewg.org or check out the EWG Instagram account at Environmental Working Group. If you liked this episode, send it to a friend who you think would like it too. Environmentalism is all about meeting people where they're at. And if you're listening to this, you probably know someone who might be interested in today's episode, but doesn't know it yet. My ask is that you send it to that person or as many people as you see fit. Today's episode was produced by the amazing Beth Rowe and Mary Kelly. Our show's theme music is by Moby, and thank you, Moby. And thank all of you again for listening.